Hello, and welcome to our first Subnet talk of 2024. Yeah, see, you have to set the bar low. I would love to welcome Lyndsey Walsh. She's a designer, an editor, a writer, a lecturer, and she's based in Berlin. Currently, she is on a visiting scholar and resident artist at the Department of Experimental Biophysics at the Humboldt University. And she works and explores the extensibility surrounding the cultural and social aspects of disease, identity, body, death, culture, human and non-human relationships. So let's get ready for your talk about creatures and their creators.
Yes, thank you so much for the intro, Rudiger, and thank you so much for having me here. So when thinking about what to talk about in relation to the Subnet 2024 theme on community, in relation to my own practice, I decided to frame this talk on the relationship between creatures and their creators. I hope that maybe it won't always be clear who is the creature and who's the creator in this talk, and we can destabilize that a bit. But we often think of creatures or monsters as existing outside of a community or perforating the community through themes of horror and hauntings and disturbances. But creatures and monsters, to me, are also essential members of a community, even if they may terrorize it at times. Their bodies may also themselves be a community of assembled components, as you'll see in some of the monsters that I showed to you today. However, monsters and creatures also form these communities with their creators themselves. And the communities are often the very things that define what a monster is or what it can be. So I'd like to first kind of introduce myself and my practice, a little bit more than Rudiger's introduction. Yeah, why I'm so fascinated by creatures and monsters, which starts with me explaining how I perceive the role of technology in our world. So from the wheel to the internet, I see the world as becoming irreversibly and as continually made anew by technology. I see technology, even in its broadest definitions, as an interface of interactions with the world and an application of collective knowledge and cultural practice. So as an artist, I'm really interested in the ruptures that technology causes, both physically in our world, but also immaterially in our culture, our politics, our sense of identity, and even in our emotions and collective and individual imaginations. My practice kind of fuses speculative narratives with horror and autoethnographic investigations into these sorts of ruptures created by technology and the corporeality of our culture. And I set out to question the cultural binaries of human and non-human, disease and healthy, life and machine, using crip, queer, and intersectional feminist frameworks. And my own obsession with monsters as these creatures are emerging from these ruptures follows really my love of horror movies. And American studies scholar Christian Nuppler describes the monster in the US genre of horror as having an inevitable return, often in the form of an endless, critically scorned remakes. These remakes and returns often have the monster falling short in regard to what it once was, but serve as an important cultural function of updating and accessing what he calls an otherwise obscure cultural fears. So there will be plenty of monster remakes as well along the way, and maybe we'll make some more later after the talk. So historically, when we think about monsters and our relationships with creators, specifically within science and technology, monsters have played actually a really important role within science itself. By the turn of the 18th century, monsters kind of emerged within Western culture as a scientific instrument. However, the notions of the monster as a controllable resource to be harnessed for human means and ends and progress civilization is not only just a Western concept. During this time period in other areas of the world, they approached monsters through the same naturalized and domesticated lens, such as in Japan, whose Edo era, the shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune spawned what curator Kawagawa Masanobu of the Hyogo Prefectural History Museum calls Edo's yokai revolution, where the yokai, or sort of demon spirits, were naturalized along with the flora and fauna of the country into sort of a cultural database. And that later then spawned the game Bakuman, which has become what we know today as Pokemon. And there are also some parallels in China as well that have these sort of certain similar parallels about the monster being sort of domesticated and naturalized within the scientific lens. In Western culture, though, the monster was made into a scientific tool to be used to define the abnormal and normal, which could reveal things to us about the natural world and phenomenon. This was driven to the point in which scientists began to attempt to create monsters in their experiments as a means to unravel their secrets. However, there were problems, as historian and philosopher of science Douglas Alchin notes, that when used as experimental benchmarks, such as in Geoffrey St. Hilary's sort of experiments on teratomas and teratology, that regardless of whether or not scientists committed interventions, organisms tended to die rather than develop differently. So there was this resistance for an organism to become a monster. And this idea would further purport this power of these natural monsters over experimental ones that somehow are more magical and mystical. So my particular monster that I've become enamored with at the beginning of sort of my, or during my master's thesis at Symbiotica, is the teratoma. And I was also really interested in sort of these experimental monsters born from hands aided by technoscientific extensions. And the teratoma itself I see as this sort of lurking figure within science, specifically within stem cell biology. For those who don't know, a teratoma is a monstrous tumor, literally the name means monster mass, characterized by having multiple cell types and often noted for being able to grow teeth and hair. The teratoma is a monster that I have found haunts and returns to wreak havoc on the study and the material potential of stem cells. It is a monster that both resists and rebels against neoliberal capitalist agendas aiming to assert financial and economic control over potential avenues of scientific and medical research on stem cells. The teratoma embodies a horrific threat to technoscientific visions of what sociologist Melinda Cooper has coined the not yet realized surplus of life in her book, Life is Surplus, which promotes the notion that a kind of biological potential exists within sort of stem cells that can fulfill these sort of promises and being capable of being harnessed to meet the demands of a neoliberal market and the politics that intersect with the bioeconomy. So the origins of stem cells, as we come to know them today, actually rose out of the disfigured corpse of the monstrous teratoma a few years before James Till and Ernest McCullough demonstrated the existence of multipotent stem cells. In their experiments with bone marrow with mice, a man named Leroy Stevens published his own research findings in 1958 that cells from his transplanted teratomas could exhibit a number of interesting cellular behaviors, such as differentiating into normal adult tissues, new teratomas, and continuous cell lines of undifferentiated cells. So, addition to this, in 2005, scientists have also said that embryonic stem cells and embryonocarcinomas, so more cancer cells of the embryonic origin, are opposite sides of the same coin. And they found that embryonocarcinomas and embryonic stem cells both represent the sort of undifferentiated cells that are desirable and that we select basically both of them for very similar characteristics. And there's lots of issues when working with stem cells in the laboratory that you really cannot know what they will become until they differentiate. So they have the potential to kind of equally become cancer as well as they become any cell in the body. However, when we think of stem cells, we don't think of that. We don't talk about that because that ruins its promising potential, because cancer is the most terrifying thing of all for cells. And my conclusions that I kind of came during my research at Symbiotica is that stem cells were never going to be able to really meet these demands that this neoliberal capitalist market was pushing on them. That's this endless surplus of life that we can use to make organs for replacements and all these sorts of things. All stem cell entities also grown in the laboratory were their own kinds of teratomas as a product of an abnormal environment, because they're not grown in the body at all. And so I created a terrible horror film sequel referencing the long legacy of fascination with stem cells and cancer monsters by artists such as my own thesis supervisor, Yonat Zur, in collaboration with Oren Katz and Jennifer Willett and Jason Knight, as well as the works by Lu Yang and her chemocobalt cancer babies and Patricia Piccanini's Still Life with Stem Cells. In my teratomas comeback, called Return of the Teratoma, very fittingly, and it definitely has that shitty sequel vibe in the name. The film itself positions these entities as pitiful but somewhat potentially threatening monsters lurking in the background of an all-too-human world, terrorizing my poor friend and dear collaborator Marc de Pasquale as he goes about his daily life in our former shared workspace. And the teratoma itself is a living thing that I grew in the lab and took care of, and it's over 180-something days old. And I made little teeth for it to wear, because every good monster in a horror film needs a good costume. And it has little eyes. The little black dots are retinal stem cells, or retinal, because it's a retinal organoid. And so it has little retinas, which could potentially, I don't know, see if it had more neurons. And the little corally bits are hypothesized to be lung tissue, but we really are not sure what it is. In addition to their embedment in the history of stem cells, teratomas are also encoded in issues concerning gender and gendered views of material potential, which we'll dive more into in a bit. Teratomas themselves emerged in their most monstrous and horrific forms with teeth and hair when originating from biological processes associated with the so-called female reproductive system, as testicular teratomas typically result in malignant testicular cancer, while ovarian teratomas are cataloged extensively in publications describing monstrous births and have a history of associations about being caused by witchcraft, adultery with the devil, and the nightmares of women. The fun stuff. These fears concerning the intersections of reproductive potential and monstrosity have resulted in a vast cultural landscape for teratomas to inhabit, following what contemporary philosopher and feminist theoretician Rosa Briodati has elaborated on concerning the imagination hypothesis and maternal creative potential. Briodati explains that this attributes to the mother the capacity to undo the living capital she is carrying in her womb. The power of her imagination is such that she can actually kill or deform her own creations. It must be borne in the mind here that the power of the imagination has been a major issue since the 17th century. At that time, it had a double function: to create order through the principle of making connections or spotting resemblance, and yet also to upset that order. A monstrous offspring, such as the teratoma, is the birth of what I have attributed in my 2018 dissertation to be Briodati's embodiment of difference, which frames a post-humanist critique on the materiality where the teratoma represents a biological other and processes to embrace, reject, or make amends with its embodied difference to give rise to narratives about forging relations with biological otherness. And to go to more personal biological otherness, and sort of the so-called female body, I would like to now introduce a different monster that is standing in front of you today. I am apparently a mutant, and my mutantness was discovered around the age of 18 when I was diagnosed as having hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome. And for those who may not be familiar with that type of syndrome, it's a mutation of the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes, which is linked to having a very high risk of breast cancer, but also ovarian cancer and cancer of your colon and your pancreas and your peritoneum lining. But those organs kind of get written out because it's all about boobs and ovaries in the medical industry with this. Currently, my medically assigned risk assessment for breast cancer is at 94% probability, so I would not bet against my chances of getting it. And because I'm medically assigned female at birth, despite being non-binary, I've also experienced numerous frictions with my doctors to negotiate care that doesn't medically force the binary of male and female onto my body through preventative hormone therapies and the planning of preventative surgeries. And this position that we've now shifted in with healthcare in terms of preventative medicine has really allowed the emergence or creations of mutants that walk among us. And Susan E. Kelly attributes this to the genomic era that we're now in, as the metaphor of the genetic body now is what's predominant within medicine. Kelly elaborates that the genetic body describes these changes to capture transformations not only in disease concepts, but in the modes of production, technoscientific identities, and social relations, and the broader interfaces with biomedical, cultural, and governmental modalities that have characterized our genetic era. And because of this, bodies end up getting fragmented and give way to this concept of genetic risk, which characterizes the influence of a perceived risk for developing a disease based on the action of singular genes without providing any concurrent ability to treat said problem. And based on someone's genetic risk, the disease narrative also ends up shifting. So I am, in theory, I have other issues, but relatively young and somewhat healthy. But at the same time, I have an oncologist and I'm treated as a cancer patient. So to embody these dual states and to be seen through two different states at the same time presents sort of a Schrodinger's cat situation. And because of that, subjective experience also shifts, because you're both sick and not sick all at the same time. You must live and perform an identity of being sick and not sick all at the same time. And in the US, which is where I wrote this article about because I was quite angry, I was told by my health insurance company that they would only cover my preventative screenings as long as I did not have cancer. Because once I had cancer, that was a pre-existing condition, even though it's a condition of my existence because it's genetic. And I would not be covered. Technically, this is a issue with the Genetic Information's Non-Discriminations Act of 2008, where you are only protected against discrimination from genetic-based conditions as long as you do not have symptoms of said genetic difference. What is supposed to fit in there to prevent this problem is Obamacare, which loves to be butchered, and health insurance companies really don't take as seriously as they should. And who wants to fight a health insurance company with a lawyer when you need to go through cancer treatments? It's quite a lot. But luckily, I don't live in the US anymore. Because screw that. However, the way that we position breast cancer itself, because we have to look at the bigger picture, because breast cancer itself is a very interesting disease. And it's also a disease that actually is one of the highest likelihoods of mortality of people who are labeled women around the world as well, and one of the most common forms of cancer in the entire world. And it's a disease that's depicted in the media in a specific way, and it's a specific kind of disease because it's directly attacking cultural and social values of femininity and gendered notions of reproductive potential. As we can see here, all of the programs to kind of fight breast cancer occur in really, really messed up ways. For example, apparently the only thing worth saving is not people's lives, but second base, according to the Tao Beach in Las Vegas. This woman doesn't even have a head. So why would we save her when we can save second base? And the American Cancer Society has also been part of this problem. In 1969, they placed certain topics off limits for discussion, such as family relationships, the doctors and scar itself, having gone through breast cancer, and emphasizing instead this goal of convincing women that with mastectomies that they do not have a handicap, but a condition from which they can recover, given the right attitude, clothes, and prosthesis. So yeah, you have cancer, but it will be fine because we will make you have new boobs, and if you have a good attitude about it, you've got it. And so talking about the mutant, because being both sick and not sick, what do we do with mutants? Because I'm a mutant right now, but genetic testing is going to only get better. Many people have potentially done it. If anyone's done 23andMe or one of those other things, I don't recommend doing them, but that's a different story. But there will be more mutants. I will not be alone. I'm just the first one to suffer the consequences. And so when thinking about the mutant as a monster, leads us to talk about mutational identity theory and how this really shifts notions of identity. And Jason Zingsam defines mutational identity as something that leads us to view identity and individuals as composed of multiple mutants or subjectivities. A historical individual is not simply a mutant, rather he or she is composed of a multiple of mutants, a team of subjectivities, each shifting and morphing with his or her own power and with unpredictable relationships to each other. We can think of the X-Men. They are not the X-Man, they are the X-Men. There's this pluralistic component of it. But also through mutational identity theory within my own sort of narrative and my own identity, the identities of individuals diagnosed with these mutations are in constant flux throughout their lifetimes. They exist within multiplicities within their own identity, but also intersect through this multi-generational lineage, because I found out I'm a mutant because my mom got breast cancer when I was a teenager, and I got it from my mother. And so my identity as a mutant is not just my own, it's something I share with my mother and my other family members. And so it kind of creates a messy form of a disease narrative because it doesn't just start with me, it starts with someone else, and it doesn't just impact me, it impacts someone else. And we are not separate, we cannot be separated. And also an embodiment of identity through materiality and a limited agency over the ways that these subjects impact self-concept, because I cannot change my genome. That is impossible. I don't even think I would want to. Yeah, so we have the ad again for saving second base, but also when looking at how this shifts into not only fighting breast cancer to save second base, but also narratives about this sort of character of the previvor that's emerged for fellow mutants like myself. The previvor term, and for those who don't know, previvors refer to someone identified as surviving the predisposition of having a disease, which is quite a bizarre term. It was coined in the year 2000 by Sue Friedman and the organization Facing Our Risk of Cancer Empowered, otherwise known as FORCE. And this term was coined to attempt to build a sense of identity and community for those pre-diseased. So not diseased, but pre-diseased. However, the previvor narrative has an emphasis on the act of choice, even though this agency is horribly limited by the unpredictability of a disease and the social political impact of the genetic body. Because I can take care of myself all I want, but I can't control the American government, for example, or the German government, or the German health insurance system, or getting a doctor's appointment, or many other things. Another prevalent issue is that a large portion of the previvor narratives focus on maintaining societal expectations of gender and body norms, especially in the narrative of surgical reconstruction, with Angelina Jolie being the poster child for this entire movement, where people were also saying, well, Angelina Jolie got her breast removed, but at least she's still hot, like, which is quite a way to reduce something that was probably a life-saving decision for her, considering it killed her mother. And because my work with mutants is rather personal, I frame this as my sort of villainous origin story of my own monstrosity on the rise. Sorry, clicking is not working for a second. Oh, because there's a video. Yeah. And so this villainous origin story starts in an unlikely place of St. Petersburg, Russia, where a large portion of this research emerged from a project called Prophylaxis that I did in collaboration with ITMO University's Art and Science Center in 2021. During this research residency, I interviewed experts in genetic testing and sociology in Russia about hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome and the impact of genetic data laws and so-called women's healthcare within the context of the Russian Federation, which I went there with the idea that this was going to be really interesting, and I had no idea what I was getting into. And it was really interesting and way weirder than I thought it would be. So my interview with Dr. Anastasia Novoskhutskaya, who is here in a screenshot, she's a sociologist from the European University, revealed several interesting findings. She first explained that the most comprehensive healthcare format is often inaccessible for most Russians who live outside major cities. However, it is normal for workplaces and schools to require gynecological exams, as this is a kind of medical surveillance that begins in early childhood with yearly pelvic exams starting around the ages of 7 or 8 years old. There. This also happens for little boys too, but quite a young age to have very invasive sort of surveillance. And although these exams are only performative and do not have any legitimate medical value, they literally just hand you a piece of paper with a stamp that you take so that you can go to school. This causes individuals to feel a false sense of security that they've done the clinical labor that they need to for the year so that they're healthy and they don't have any diseases, when in reality these doctors are actually not really diagnosing things that could be wrong and will not write something on a paper because they just want to check a box on a form. And lastly, she explained that the Russian healthcare for women is largely focused on pro-neonatal issues, which most cases of genetic testing being implemented are for fetal genetic diagnostic tests rather than for things like cancer and other base diseases. Legally, Russia has followed suit with many other countries, prioritizing genetic testing strategies, though. Vladimir Putin's official decrees from 2019 ordered for the creation of genetic passports for all Russian nationals by the year 2025, which is coming up. I don't know if they're still doing this, because it seems like they're a bit preoccupied with other ventures that are questionable, but under the national chemical and biological security strategy, he ordered for the creation of a national genetic information database, placing genetic testing and data as a militarized form of care rather than a strictly healthcare-based approach. So all Russian genetic data is technically a bioweapon. And being an American going to Russia, starting to ask questions about this was not super smart. But despite these decrees, the legality of using genetic information in medical systems remains really unclear because the way Russia works is that Putin says things, and then people were like, okay, now what? And then there's no context often or follow-up. And so these doctors and researchers who are doing this are just like, I don't know what to do anymore, and it's very unclear. So I interviewed the founders of Moscow-based genetic testing company called OncoAtlas, Vladislav Milieko, and one of their doctors, Dr. Alexander Reznik, and confirmed that there's a massive lack of infrastructure for genetic testing and its implementation in healthcare within the Russian Federation. They also experienced serious concerns about the ethical and social impacts for Putin's decrees, as genetic data falls within the security strategy. They explained that there are already laws in place forbidding the exchange of genetic information and data between the Russian Federation and any other countries due to the government's view that this is a weapon and it could be used to compromise national security. So there's this sort of need in the healthcare system and from researchers themselves to want to help people, but kind of unsure how, and also cannot collaborate with anyone. And since Russia invaded Ukraine, that has also further increased, I imagine. Starkly in contrast, I ended up bringing this project to its fully commissioned format with the BioArt Society in Helsinki, Finland. And so I got to do a lovely investigation of the Finnish context of this sort of research, which I did not know this until I started asking questions, is that Finland is one of the leading countries in the EU on banking genetic data and looking at genetic-based diseases. And they're doing this because Finland has a very extreme bottleneck effect. And they have a lot of very problematic disease-related mutations that only Finland has, to the point where Finnish genetic data cannot be counted in any global surveys because they are massive outliers, which was really interesting to me. And for the site-specific video that I made for the self-care installation in Helsinki, I interviewed Dr. Kristiina Atomaki, who is the Finnish leading expert on both genetic data and testing and also breast cancer research. She explained to me how Finland has been the forerunner in the EU Beyond 1 Billion Genomes project, which is working to create the European networks for sharing genetic and clinical data. She also discussed how Finland has extensive legal frameworks to build healthcare strategies, as genetic information is viewed as part of healthcare itself, which is very different from Russia. So it's within the context of everyone gets access to it. It should become a routine thing. And it also falls legally into the Finnish constitutional protection of the right to life as well. So a very different framework from Russia, also very different framework from the United States. And so in Germany, these issues are very complicated because Germany has quite private data systems about healthcare and genetics due to the eugenic things that they did during the Holocaust. Makes sense. And so when I brought this work back to Germany, it was kind of a bit more difficult to start to tease out as well. So the German context of the work is yet to be explored in its entirety, other than from my own patient perspective. So in its artistic text, I describe self-care, the artwork, as an artistic attempt to reckon with the ruptures in identity caused by the rising use of genetic diagnostics in medicine, and a narrative seeking to resist the confines of this medical gaze. The project uses my own body and my genderqueer identity and experiences as a framework for exploring global perspectives of notions of health and disease concerning embodied genetic difference. A major feature of this work is this chest binder I have made, which houses living BRCA1 mutant breast cancer cells of the cell line HCC1937, and the wearer can attempt to care for them. The cells themselves, in their kind of fluid container, also act as a functional part of the binder to literally help bind the breasts as well. So there's kind of an unintentional mutualistic, maybe caring component with the cancer cells. And the title of this work originates as a critique to the meaning of the ascribed notion of self-concept in scientific studies, as well as to the shift in the role of the individual to be the sole responsibility bearer of preventative healthcare frameworks, which Jackie Stacey describes in her book Teratologies, as shifting the weight of responsibility completely onto the individual. And so the self that I really arrived to in self-care is forever at odds with and is entangled in these subjectivities of care of others. The self is searching out answers from these global experts and country-specific nuances about care, but also grappling with my own intergenerational trauma and misgenderings with my familiar relationships, particularly with my mother, and planning a future of lifelong care and consultations with doctors, and most importantly, attempting, and up until very recently, often failing to care for the needs of the living cancer cells within the work, which who would have thought I'm such a good cancer killer? It was quite a surprise. And the work itself works within the genres of horror to kind of destabilize what a body is and what it can be with the abject, and aims to unsettle viewers regardless of their associations with hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome. And this is kind of what the installation looks like in Helsinki, where the binder lives within a specially designed incubator closet, because I cannot wear it at all times, since I have other things I have to go do sometimes. And they have to stay warm, and my body heat cannot be used at all moments of the day. But yeah, it has its little feeding station, and then in the back there's a video that I'm about to get more into as well. And in the Helsinki installation I also featured kind of more things about the design of the wearable itself, to give sort of insight with the public how I came to create this sort of chest binder. And so the two video works that I've ended up accompanying, one that was made for the installation originally in Helsinki, and another one that I did last year when it was reinstalled at Art Laboratory Berlin in Germany, are A Letter to My Mother and Mammography Techniques. Mammography Techniques was made first. Yeah, the kind of diving into this issue literally with my mother, I decided to interview her, and she ended up telling me all these really horrific things that have traumatized me deeply. But it was great content for the art. And some of these things were things that she decided to only get breast reconstruction to please my father. Which I was like, wow, you told me to never change myself for any lover, what the hell? And she was like, marriage is a compromise. And I was like, no, it's not like that, but whatever. And that the surgeon who ended up doing her breast reconstruction ended up making her breast bigger than what she had asked for, which I was like, that sounds like medical malpractice. And she said, I don't see it that way. So it was a riveting interview, and it's like 35 minutes long of me just going, what the hell is happening the entire time? And then the follow-up to this, a year later, was this video work titled A Letter to My Mother, because I had feedback. In this video, I describe cancer kind of as this family heirloom or an inherited creature, referencing the words and title of author Lydia Yuknovich's A Letter to My Rage. Within A Letter to My Mother, I describe the ways that my mother, her mother, and her mother's mother have all succumbed to a familial legacy of cancer, because cancer is just abundant in my family. I also attempt to grapple with my failures as a child to care for my mother when she had cancer. To be fair, I was 15 on my part, but I literally abandoned her during her course of treatment. And also my perceived mother's failures as a parent to care for and understand me throughout my own struggles with gender dysphoria and the outcomes of medical interventions related to my own hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome. Notions of self-concept that begin to take shape in A Letter to My Mother follow an approach consistent with mutational identity theory, as they show that they're intersectional, they're entangled, that my identity is not actually my own identity. It is also, unfortunately, entrapped with my mother's identity, as I'm pretty sure with anyone who has a mother can understand, or just parent in general, really. Shifting away from human mutants, though, we're going to just do a sharp left-hand turn into non-human mutants, looking at the non-human mutants I have worked at with my relationship with the Department of Experimental Biophysics at Humboldt University, where I first came to Humboldt in 2019 to basically challenge a bunch of different genetically modified algae to compete in dance battles for my affection. And it was really, by affection, I mean to survive, because the losers died. They all ended up dying in the end. But for this situation, I was really interested in these ideas because the lab that I was working with was looking at the ways that algae respond to different light stimuli and trying to modify it, with the outcome being that you could then modify and optimize these biological systems to make biofuel and all these other sort of pharmaceutical products and protein-based end products and other ideas for optogenetics, which is this idea that we can then use all of this information and modify individual cells, ideally in your brain, to respond to light on a cellular level, which would hopefully treat things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. So I thought, why not make sure that the mutants are behaving in the ways that they've been genetically programmed to through dance, because I like the game Dance Dance Revolution, and it was very popular in the 90s and early 2000s in the United States and Japan, not in Germany, as I have found out, because all the Germans I talked to had no idea what I was talking about, and mentioning the abbreviation DDR brought up the wrong connotations. In the game, players were prompted to complete dance choreographies for the actual game Dance Dance Revolution by placing their foot on one of 4 arrows that was directed by the game. Performance researchers have noted that this game is an important nexus in questioning the relationship between the player and the game, thus bringing into questions the ways in which bodies are literally given shape and configured to performances of video gaming, and the practice's capacity to subvert dominant systems of meaning-making. So with this aesthetic experience of Dance Dance Revolution as a helpful performative setup for creating my choreography with the algae, I thought I would make my algae into dancing performing players, trying to appease not only myself but also the machine that they were dancing for. And I found out that algae are really bad dancers. Even though I tried really hard to make the choreography fit within the notions of algae time and space, which are different from human time and space. But they really are bad dancers. And through this sort of meaning-making and mattering through sensorial experiences, complicated this notion of both their agency and my own. Because like, if they're genetically programmed to respond in predictable ways, why aren't they doing this when I make them dance? What am I doing wrong? What are they doing wrong? Who is at fault here? I think both of us. Mostly me, though. And Dance Dance Revolution was a really helpful device to communicate this with audiences, as one, it's completely nonsensical, so it brings this very controversial issue of genetic engineering to a very absurd place, which makes it easier for people to engage with. Yeah, ended up leading to this sort of follow-up work that was equally as nonsensical, called Living Waste, where I had all this algae waste from the dancing, and I wanted to do something with it. And the Humboldt Forum needed an artwork for their exhibition Nachte Natur. And I thought it would be a brilliant idea to put the trash that was alive in the museum and try to bureaucratically figure out how to do that in Germany, which is the country, I think, with the most strict legal regulations of genetically modified organisms in the world. And this took what I thought would be maybe 6 months of paperwork, 2 years, with people freaking out hysterically at me and threatening me with criminal sentences. Yeah, there was a really long series of obstacles of what I would call this hysteria of GMO panics, where someone at the government may have thought that the child could break into the museum and commit high art theft and drink said algae waste, to which the museum was incredibly insulted that someone thinks that they would let high art theft be committed in their museum. However, it worked, and I got a genetic engineering facility made in this tiny little glass box where I put my trash for everyone to see. And the trash slowly dies and turns a really ugly brown color, and then the museum calls me and tells me to come make it pretty again, which has created this wonderful performance narrative about the aesthetics of trash, and also tiny genetic engineering facilities as well, because I have never seen one so small. But back to sort of maybe more medically human-y entanglements with monstrous differences. This is a work that I have that is about to debut. It was supposed to be today, but now I think it's tomorrow. Called Unbearable with the gallery, NFT gallery TX. This is what it was installed at Frieze Art Week New York in, I think, last year. And with this work, I'm really interested in sort of these queer narratives, having dealt with all the sort of repercussions of a reproductive narrative dictating my entire life with this breast cancer thing. What would it be like to set bodies free that are ascribed to follow this reproductive narrative if they were free from their services of breeding and this whole narrative of breeding? And I was really inspired by the author Lydia Yukonovich, where she writes that I would set us free from the word mother. May your body be yours again. May your blood belong to you again. Even to the dead mothers, may your body belong to whatever you might have become had you not been strapped to the service of breeding. And to the blossom of every girl ever born, may that violent rush of cosmic possibility in your body between your legs be let loose from reproduction. May you open yourselves to the cosmos, creating new constellations, and may it wreck the wrong world back to life. So Unbearable as a series attempts to queer so-called reproductive organs, and by embodying these words, free them from their services of breeding. It sets loose an unruly and technologically mediated imagination, as I worked in collaboration with AI, to explore how these organs can mutate and transform beyond reproductive narratives and the stories that history has attached to them. By setting these organs free from reproduction, sorts of new narratives have begun to emerge where things like menopause are no longer considered from this loss of breeding potential, but as an actual serious medical condition, which is what it is, because people break their bones when they have menopause if not treated correctly, which is why there's that stereotype of old ladies falling down and can't getting up and needing life alert, at least in the US. But also things like endometriosis and polycystic ovarian cancer, polycystic ovarian syndrome really shift narratives as very serious medical conditions, and this whole hormone regulation shifts from something about reproduction to something much more kind of taken more seriously. And the existence of these sort of monstrous base organs, because they're quite visually different and often blurred between phallic and non-phallic, because words are struggling to come to my head right now, spawns questions about what other purposes, that these organs could play in our body, and also how these organs themselves can work to sort of wreck this wrong world back to life. And also, through this process of working with AI, this unexpectedly ended up being a creative exploration to the tension between digital regimes of censorship and medical fragmentation of so-called female reproductive organs, where I was trading images back and forth between myself and also different AI programs, which I was doing images because the AIs did not realize what the images were. They were of different reproductive organs of animals, because finding a lot of human uteruses online is not that possible. And also using animals references sort of this domestication process of breeding that has given notion to the idea of the female animal, which has been a phenomenon extensively discussed by historians Carol Smith Rosenberg and Charles Rosenberg in 1973. So by trading these images back and forth, I wanted to challenge these processes of fragmentation to grapple to understand and know that these organs and this sort of collective machine-human archiving of it could generate sort of and imagine new ways out of this heteronormative feedback loop that endlessly persists. And one of the, I promise this is the second last monster I shall introduce. This is the project that I have currently going on right now called Foul Actions at a Distance. And this project is a sort of a monster that doesn't seem very monstrous, but more of a monster that brings out maybe a more monstrous process. But this project explores how the future is a created concept, and it's been inspired by Xiaowei Wang's blockchain chicken farm. This project transverses cultural perceptions of rural environments as backwards landscapes using quantum navigation, which is a perception that birds have to perceive magnetic fields on our planet and do long-term migration. I did not look at birds who do migration. Instead, I'm looking at chickens who don't do any migration. But scientists believe that chickens, like other birds, perceive magnetic fields through an experience of quantum entanglement occurring in their eyes' cryptochrome photoreceptor. This means that in the photoreceptor there are two spatially separated electrons that are entangled to form a radical pair, which is magnetically sensitive through quantum spin, facilitating this sort of sensing capabilities. And the project itself references Albert Einstein's infamous quote about quantum behavior as spooky actions at a distance, so more monstrous maybe effects. While quantum theory has notoriously haunted Einstein throughout his career, it also facilitates quantum-inspired frameworks for thinking about the relationship between technology and farming, and also urban and rural spaces, because we think of these as two separate things. But in reality, they're often entangled and haunting each other, and impact both at the exact same time. So the project itself explores these quantum-like effects by manifesting chicken specters through remote sensing technologies in farming and XR techniques to monitor these, what I'm hoping to train them to sense magnetic anomalies, which will meet my chickens in a second, that will transcend, extend, and manipulate their perception of time and space and project them into a gallery, thereby crossing this bridge between rural and urban spaces. And becoming a haunting in itself of the gallery through chickens. And these are my chickens. Their names are Nugget and Poultrygeist, and I hatched them from eggs. And I'm very proud of them. Those are their baby photos. They're grown-up chickens now. Yeah, I had never raised chickens before, and I didn't realize you have to teach them everything, including not to eat their own poo. It's a lot. But they are very cute, and even if they do not sense magnetic anomalies correctly, I am very proud of them. Because one, they hatched, and two, they've made it this far. I mean, they're a little older than this right now. And they've completely imprinted on me as well, further creating this sort of queer crip art farm, because one of them hatched disabled and I had to do physical therapy for it every single day, which if you look up how to do physical therapy for a chicken online, there's not a lot of information about that because they usually just kill them. So that was a process in itself. But yeah, Nugget loves the camera as well, so potential momager actions can take place. The development of this project has emerged from sort of a residency that I had with Council Plus and the Zeal Collective as part of the Erasmus Plus Atelier Rockstar program. And because it's still ongoing, oh yeah, this is them discovering what cilantro is as babies. They were not into it, but it's cute to see them try to interact with it. And to then go into a project that I will be developing hopefully in the future, also bridging off of kind of the work that I did that allowed me to meet Rudiger at TTT's fellowship that took place in Corfu last year. I was looking at, through reproductive technology investigations from my point of view, a non-breeding perspective, I was looking at the placenta as an interface, a metaphor, and a site of investigation. And from this, I really kind of have developed now, leaning on sort of Amy Hamarai and Kelly Fritch's Crypt Technoscience Manifesto that was published in 2019. So Crypt Technoscience has 4 different commitments, which is Crypt Technoscience centers the work of disabled people as knowers and makers. It is committed to using access as a point of friction. It is committed to the interdependence of political technology, and it is also committed to disability justice. Crypt Technoscience itself defines as a powerful, messy, non-innocent, contradictory, and nevertheless crucial work of engaging in practices to critique, alter, and reinvent our material discursive world. The manifesto that they made defines modes of technoscientific practice that positions disabled people as the expert designers of everyday life, which is often different than how we think of them in many design applications, where they're usually the users of technology. And also, it itself refuses to comply with demands to cure, fix, or eliminate disability, thereby assimilating disabled people within a normative body and ability mindset. So in my fellowship with TTT in 2023, I coincidentally just emerged from the hospital for a sudden and very serious bout of organ failure, caused by issues that I have with my immune system. So it was very fitting for this to fit within disability justice. But within the framework of my TTT fellowship, I was interested, in examining reproductive technologies from this non-breeding perspective, and how the placenta is an interface of care, and placentas really have developed throughout time in very different ways. It's one of the most fascinating organs, I personally think, being a biologically complex interface between two different organisms. Not only does the placenta have its own sort of autonomy about what it will select to allow in terms of different molecular pathways and stuff to go between these two organisms, but it also has one of the most biologically complex vascular systems in the body. And there's some hypothesis about its own sort of immune function in regulating the exchange of diseases, for example, between a mother and a fetus. And there's also some theories about it being a parasite that emerged within our development that is very unclear, and no one knows what happens with marsupials. The research, this is literally from a paper, everyone just has question marks because that's super confusing. But yeah, with different organisms, there's different placental designs and setups, and they're all quite complex and unique, which you would be surprised considering they're all mammals. You would think they were a bit similar. So from this, I am collaborating with my dear friend Manzi Jane. Manzi works a lot with performance and their character Tomato Love that enacts this narrative about eating the self, and also with Glitch and their photography practice. Like me, Manzi also has a very personal relationship with cancer, as they have recently completed their remission in their cancer journey. Manzi and I bonded over this unique experience of confronting mortality and being sick while being incredibly young, having both of our health or lack thereof ravage our 20s. Being young and sick is something that other people who haven't gone through this experience just cannot understand. Also, notions of disability and sickness add this whole other dimension to this time in your life. And also the way people treat you, and often I find even today people say horrific ableist comments about my body and me all the time and my life choices when it's just none of their business. So for, example like how I shouldn't be allowed to have children because I'm so broken and messed up and all these sorts of things. And what kind of life would that be? And but these are oftentimes things that people who are disabled get pushed into. It's like, I would rather die than be disabled, or like, you're so brave for doing what you are doing, or for literally living, as if you had any other choice. Or, oh, won't I be so excited to have gene therapy and just have everything fixed when there's only more complications for that. Or that my body's only good for scientific research as well. All these sorts of different problematic ideas. And we see this all the time in everyday discussions. For example, the anti-vax conspiracy has historically centered its blatant view that having autism is worse than the possibility of succumbing from a fatal viral infection, when in reality, vaccines don't actually cause autism. And also, there's nothing wrong with being autistic at all. Definitely not worth dying over. But this is the thing, this perspective about disability and sickness stems from how it shaped this horrifically globalized worldview that disabled and sick people don't belong in visions of the future. It's always, if in the future you will be cured, you will be rebuilt, we will have the technology, but there's this underlying threat that many disabled people's experience with these demands. If you don't comply, then you don't get to have a future. If you aren't going to be cured, if you're not going to assimilate, then you don't belong in the future. But looking through crypt technoscience, it raises this question of what would the future look like if disabled people were the ones making it? And so aligned with this framework, Manzi and I have come up with this sort of developing project that we are now applying for funding to realize called Trophobiont. Trophobiont sets out to artificially grow a placenta organ outside of the body, exploring future forms of nutrition for disabled individuals like ourselves, and maybe in the process creating a vampiric queer crip cult. Nutrition for disabled people is a biotech topic that's often inadequately addressed in envisioning notions of a future. We scorn this idea of surviving off Soylent in the future, but there are literally people now who can only consume this for their survival. I also readily engage in these arguments with environmentalists and vegans about the future of food sustainability because I medically can't eat the majority of all fruits and vegetables and hence can't be vegan or vegetarian, but yet I'm the one causing climate change. I don't know. otherwise I can't have a plant-based diet. I would starve to death. So there's a lot of contradictory notions of what future is with what disabled people actually experience and how function and live. So the practice of eating placentas as a nutrition has many ritualistic components attached to it. The often able-bodied notion is this, and contemporary one, is this notion of consuming the placenta to prevent anti-aging, which I think is quite widespread. And there's a conversation that has emerged on TikTok lately about looking at this fixation with getting older, where people are often asking them to ask how old they are, and do millennials actually look younger than Gen Z? I don't know. But for many disabled creators on the platform, the response has always been, I would give anything to be able to live this long to look older. To get older is such a privilege, and to look older. Conversely, non-human organisms often consume the placenta and exhibit pain-reducing effects for afterbirth, suggesting placentophagy has beneficial impacts to help endure the shifting bodily impact of pregnancy and birth. So Monzi and I would like to grow our own placenta taken from trophoblast cells made from one of Monzi's harvested oocytes that were taken in their kind of before journey with chemo preventatively, and seed it with my donor DNA. This placenta will be fed blood offerings of our larger cult community that will grow our newly formed vampiric placenta cult and the placenta itself. And once the placenta reaches its desired capacity for growth, we will ritualistically harvest it and nourish ourselves as the ultimate gluttonous feast, because the idea that we can be gluttonous and enjoy our nutrition as disabled queer individuals confront the very notion that we should be subservient to the idea that we're just going to survive. And we, through this process, placentophagy would obviously not cure any conditions that we have, because nutrition alone can only do so much. But the idea of nourishing and feasting has its own sorts of kind of care involved in it, even though it's not curative, it's not assimilative, it's not fixing said problem. But it also potentially, through this pain-relieving capacity that we've seen in animals, hypothetically, maybe, I don't know, probably no scientific basis of this, but there could be some pain-relieving effects of having to exist in an able-bodied world that denies us the possibility of having a future, thereby challenging the notions of also family, the future of food, reproduction, and biotech. And I have talked too much, but thank you so much for being such a great audience. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Lyndsey. So let's skip over to the questions. I suppose an important part of Subnet talk is questions. Who has a question? I have many. Shall I start? So when you talk about monsters, to what extent do you see the thing that when you talk about Frankenstein's monster, which is the most obvious choice, of course, to what extent do you see that actually monsters say much more about our society and what this society is going through at this moment than actually what the monster is?
Yeah, I think that, and also that the looking at like the mutant, the fact that I've become a mutant, because I've had this argument with scientists. They're like, you're not a mutant. Mutants are what we make in a lab. And I'm like, no, but I was made a mutant by society because I literally have a piece of paper that says I'm a pathology with my little ID number, rather than a non-pathology, which I think most people get to be, genetically speaking. But yeah, society really makes the monster itself. So yeah, that I think the process of making speaks a lot as well about who is actually monstrous. And the mechanisms of making can kind of be unraveled and untangled to kind of explore that relationship between the maker and the monster. I don't know if that answered your question, though.
It did.
Okay, cool.
So it was a rhetoric question to a certain extent, but I think we both, yeah, it was basically exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
Finland genetics. You talked about that Finland has such strange genetics. Why do you think it is this way? Is it maybe because they were so isolated for such a long time, or what makes them so special?
I think that's the hypothesis. To be honest, the history of Finland, because I went to school in America, we skipped a lot of things about Europe that are probably really important.
Most things.
Yeah.
History of 500 years, I think.
All I got is the mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell. I don't know why that's still there. I don't know too much about historically, but I think this is the hypothesis, is that Finland kind of isolated themselves. There's also lots of other bottlenecked effects in populations. So technically, which I didn't talk about this in my presentation, but in the US, which this is illegal in Germany to test people on this basis for, and you'll find out in a moment why. My mother only got tested because she's an Ashkenazi Jew, because there is another bottleneck effect genetically with Ashkenazi Jews. And I also got tested for this reason, and I told my doctor in Germany this, and she was horrified. And then I realized why she was horrified, and it made a lot of sense. But yeah, these other sorts of, there's other populations that have other bottlenecked effects. Some of them are actually what I have found to be problematic with the breast cancer thing in particular, is that actually there's suspected to be a large amount of undiagnosing of, in the United States, of Black and Hispanic individuals for these mutations, because they are not perceived to have these sorts of medical identities like Ashkenazi Jews have, which fits into really problematic narratives about racism in the US medical system. But each country is different with this as well, because in Russia, it was a completely different story as well. So, yeah.
No, it's funny because I just started listening to Robert Sapolsky's lectures, Stanford lectures, and he said one of the real key elements to cooperation is actually incest. It basically comes down to bottlenecks. I mean, of course, it's exaggerated, but it's basically what we just said. It's about bottlenecks where people have excluded, and they create certain stronger traits, and for all of those, they start to cooperate more frequently, and then the group becomes. So I thought it's just interesting.
I don't know what this says about the British family right now, though.
That's a very different question again. Any other questions?
I have a question, and I apologize in advance if this is a little surface level, because I'm not super at home in the theoretical frameworks, but I saw you refer to Rosie Braidotti.
Yeah.
And I've been reading a little bit about her post-humanism frameworks and her ideas about forgotten peoples, and I was kind of wondering how you rhyme those theories with cryptechnoscience, and kind of how those interact with each other and how they maybe amplify each other.
Yeah. So I don't think I have read this text in a long time, since graduate school, so I'm going to pivot but try to confront.
Sure.
Yeah. Because disability is an interesting one about being forgotten people or something like along this line, because literally it's one of the very few perceived minorities that everyone at some point will join, and everyone can join at any time in theory, but yeah, throughout your life everyone at some point will get sick, their hearing will start to lose, eyesight gets worse. We don't think about these things, but yeah, I think that's often something getting older people have a really hard time confronting. I know my dad did with needing hearing aids, but yeah, to be hearing impaired over age and time. And so we often think about disability like forgotten, but also literally everyone deals with it and everyone can join it. It's not like racial minorities are very different and the oppression around that is very particular, but like literally everyone at some point in their life will have to deal with disability and deal with this eventual friction in one way or another. So it's kind of, I don't know, but it also is like this haunting effect, I guess, because we don't like to think about that, and we don't want to think about that. We just want to live forever and be young and have everything be perfect. But what is perfect, and what, like, I think, yeah, these points of like access as friction, I think, is really to disturb this idea, to have everyone realize, like when I started talking about my health things and my different disabilities, and I've been like legally in a disabled category since a very young age. It's been quite, my friends are like, oh my God, wait, I have this too, but I've been so ashamed and I haven't told anyone. Or like, my hearing's actually really bad and I've never gotten tested and maybe I should, because it would actually help to have different assistive technologies with me or things like this. And access technologies, because I've done some courses in like description design and working with different accessible technologies, it's really made to improve access for everyone, actually, and the experience of something for everyone, like alt text and subtitles and all these sorts of things. At the end of the day, it's supposed to provide enough context and information to make everyone's experience enhanced. And I think one of the clearest examples that I have personally seen of this is that when I went to Documenta a few years ago with my friends who English is their second language, they found the light English or the easy read, which is made for access and disability mindset, but they found that to be like, oh my God, now I understand the curation of this exhibition. Because it's an easy to read, it has to be in this particular format, and it really, like, it can enhance the experience for everyone, because also, especially people who may be non-native English speakers as well. And we don't think about this when we talk about access or accessibility technologies or description design or subtitles necessarily, or closed captioning. But yeah, to improve experience for everyone, I think is quite important. So I hope that gets to the...
Yeah, for sure. I like the way that you kind of position crypt technoscience almost as a superpower, because you can position it towards people saying you will at some point belong to this, so you better start thinking about it and start getting involved with this kind of way of looking at things. Yeah. More so than any other underrepresented groups where you cannot be part or walk in someone's shoes.
Yeah. I hope it's not too threatening, because sometimes it sounds like a bit of a threat.
It's a bit realistic, right?
Yeah, and also at the end of the day, like, the history of disability activism has been quite, like, the point of to cause friction historically, which the writers of the Crypt Technoscience Manifesto talk about. It is to be literally like smashing stairs with and because you can't access a building and no one's going to listen to you. It's quite, you're supposed to create very active frictional things that are a bit at times perceived threatening, but literally you will be ignored otherwise. So yeah, so we should all work together, hopefully. But yeah, until then.
Thanks.
Also English as a second language question. There seems to be a difference between the term like mutant and monster, and I wonder if there is a real difference, or if it's more like a narrative or a social perspective on whether something is a mutant or a monster, or maybe there is a real definition of when, at what point you become a mutant, or it's just an abnormality or something like that. So what's the real difference?
Yeah, so technically there is no real difference because there's mutations, which we all have. If anyone has a freckle, you have a mutation. Congratulations. Are you a mutant? No, unless your dermatologist says you have skin cancer. But when we think about it scientifically, there is a very particular set boundary between being a mutant and not being a mutant. And the not mutant category is not called the normal. It's called the wild type, which is a bit weird. It has a feral notion. It's wild, with this idea that that's what's found in nature. But in reality, wild type is not found in nature because the wild type is all genetically the same, which nothing in nature has the exact same genome. That doesn't make any sense. A population of organisms would die if they were all genetically the same, because environments changes and mutations actually increase genetic resilience within a population. And a lot of the notions that I've talked about with scientists and also through this project of the GMO waste is that the mutants that we made in the lab with CRISPR-Cas9 get to be mutants, but if you got those same mutations through selective breeding and in the wild, they are not mutants. But they have the same mutation. Why? one of them has to go in a weird glass box and I get threatening paperwork. The other one can be poured down the drain. And so, yeah, it's kind of these more cultural constructions of it rather than, I guess, like a linguistic thing. But also when we think about mutant as a form of monster, I think there's also this notion that's emerged with like talking about X-Men, but also in Gattaca as well, about who gets to be then the monster. Is it the people who were designed, like designer babies are all mutants, but then they were designed in a particular way. I think it's like the six-finger piano player in Gattaca, on both of his hands, like would have been considered a monster, like back in the Wunderkammer age. But in the Gattaca future is like the expected norm that you are like programmed to fit your biological potential. So it's really these more cultural contexts that define what is mutinous and what's monstrous about it.
So I think we're slowly coming to an end. Is there last question? Shall I ask one more question then? Let me check one more time. I have many notes, but I think I once heard that actually the placenta is actually, or the uterus is actually like some kind of strange virus creature interaction. Did you ever hear that?
This is like all that hypothesis about also like the parasite thing. Yeah, I don't know what is real and what's not. They're all really fun hypotheses. I love them because it just adds to my vampiric cult thing. Especially the fact that me and Monsi kind of want to worship the placenta as a god. This project's going to be really problematic, but that's why it's still in development. But yeah, because they don't know how it evolved and like what makes mammals mammals, and also why the hell did marsupials end up so weird, and what is a platypus?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so this gets into these sorts of issues that people are really unsure about. So, and I think the placenta is radically understudied, but there's a lot of research going into artificial placentas right now because one, premature babies, it would be great if we could improve their experience at the start of their life, especially their lung development, to ensure they have a higher likelihood of surviving. And there's like a lot of different research projects being done on lambs to then be applied in premature babies, where they've made artificial wombs and things like that. I don't know if that would lead to like humans being grown outside of the body in a weird vat system. But yeah, that's a whole other sort of techno womb situation that also gets into these weird parasite-y alien structures. Yeah, that's all I got for that one.
Perfect. Thank you very much, though.
Thank you.
Have a good night.